Hi, I'm Mark Dean, and I'm the Research Fellow at the Carmichael Centre within the Centre for Future Work. I'm joined today by Lily Rains and Cantor Fellow at the Centre for Future Work to talk about 6 problems with the Fair Work Act, but more importantly, 6 solutions that can create a fairer, worker-focused agenda for industrial relations reform in Australia. So Lily, why don't you tell us about what's wrong with the Fair Work Act?
Absolutely, I can. So the first issue we have comes from enterprise bargaining. And so from the start, enterprise bargaining is our sort of current system of negotiations that go on between an employer and an employee, or more so like a collective of employees represented by a union. And so our Fair Work Act kind of limits enterprise bargaining to be between one enterprise or one employer and one group of employees. And this system made sense when it was sort of conceived in the 1980s, which is when you had, a big, large corporate or public sector body that was in one physical workplace that had thousands of employees in that one single place. But our system today has changed a lot in the last, 40 years or so. And we now have a lot of sort of employment structures where you have labour hire firms or using outsourcing, or sort of supply chains have gotten more and more complex. And so this one enterprise with one group of employees doesn't really fit as well as it used to. But despite all of this, the system hasn't changed, and unions still have to bargain with one employer for one group of employees instead of taking into account these sort of complexities.
Right, that's really interesting. So it sounds to me like the increasing fragmentation of the labour market is still, when it comes to negotiations between employers and employees, it's still structured the way that it used to be in, 40 years ago, but now where it's not fit for purpose. So enterprise bargaining is failing workers is what I'm getting from this. So do you have a solution in mind for how we could fix the enterprise bargaining system?
Yes, absolutely. So basically, we just need to update it so it's more reflective of employment today. That would be through something like multi-employer bargaining, which is just sort of a system that where collective bargaining can take into account sort of like an entire industry. So instead of one employer, you might have sort of all of the employers from that sector coming to bargain. Another sort of form of multi-employer bargaining would be something like supply chain bargaining, where you might have a union that's able to negotiate for all the sort of clinks in that chain.
So like the Woolly the fresh produce that you get at Woolies would mean that the workers that put it out on the floor are represented by the same bargaining process as the truck drivers that take it from the farms to get it to the stores.
Yeah, absolutely. And that also just makes sure that, all of the employees are sort of coming to it from similar conditions, or that's in the mind of the company that they can't just pay someone in that connection a lot less than other workers. So basically, it's just all about connecting what right now are these single negotiations between sort of small workforces into one big sort of connected collective agreement. So for example, you would have the truck drivers who deliver the produce to the supermarket who are also being negotiated for alongside, the people who pack the shelves and workers who work at the checkout and people who clean the building. And that just sort of makes sure that all of those workers are being provided, good and secure employment and good work conditions, basically.
So Lily, is there any proof that this approach works?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this approach has been taken up by a lot of other countries in the world, and all of this international evidence has shown us that when multi-employer bargaining is introduced, collective bargaining and unionisation both increase, and it produces better outcomes.
What is protected industrial action, and what is the issue with the Fair Work Act and protected industrial action?
Well, basically, the Fair Work Act has suffocated the right to strike in Australia. The problem with that is that the agreement between employers and employees is sort of hinged on this unfair power imbalance. And the power of workers really comes from their ability to withdraw labour in the face of disputes over safety and wages and work conditions. And so it's really intrinsic to sort of, labor conditions is that people are able to take that action if they need to. And this has been effectively cut off in Australia, and it's incredibly highly regulated. The Fair Work Act has a lot of procedural hurdles in place. So for an employee or a union who wants to take industrial action, as is their right, they sort of have to overcome all of these issues with getting like ballot papers signed and getting the approvals from those ballots, and then also but also throughout every step of this process, an employer can interject and basically plead that it's against public interest to let these employees take action.
So then, if it's made it really hard for workers to strike under the Fair Work Act, what would a genuine right to strike look like? What would it take for us to create a solution to this problem?
You know, the solution to this is just sort of a genuine acknowledgement that the right to strike is a very important part of, you know, our labour system. Even by the International Labour Organization is it acknowledged as being really intrinsic to employees' power. And so the Fair Work Act should just sort of reflect that a bit better. So that would be just by cutting down some of these procedural hurdles and kind of acknowledging that, you know, workers taking action and taking protected industrial action is in the public interest. Like, it is in the public interest for people to take action to protect their health, their safety, their working conditions.
Yeah, recently we've even seen that the Australian Council of Trade Unions was using the right to withdraw labour as a means of protecting workers during the Omicron wave of the coronavirus. I mean, that was exactly what you're saying, is that workers have a right to feel safe at work, and this was a means of doing that. But of course, there are strict conditions under which that can take place, which means that only if workers' health and safety is threatened on the job can they strike. Otherwise, if it was anything more, like if it was terrible pay or conditions, workers simply just can't strike, can they?
No, and even worse than that, they face really like extensive penalties and fines to both workers and unions who represent them.
Right. So, Lily, currently the Fair Work Act allows for agreement-making processes that actually bypass unions and workers. So what does that mean, and why is it a problem, and how would we fix that?
Yeah, it's a huge problem because it basically takes this premise that an enterprise agreement is made by and between employees and employers together. And it just allows for employers to basically draft their agreement, what they want, their conditions that obviously kind of slants towards their interests. They can put it to employees really early on in the process and sort of force a vote and force employees to vote on whether or not they accept the agreement or not. But you sort of got to contextualize this as if your, you know, boss or employer comes to you and tells you to sign or agree to something. A lot of workers will just say yes because, you know, it's hard to push back by yourself. And so this sort of means that we have these agreements that really heavily favour employers, and they're not in the best interest of employees and unions who represent them.
So, Lily, are there some examples you can give us of these dodgy agreements and what would be contained in them that force workers to do?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can look at agreements where maybe the rostering isn't particularly favourable for an employee. So maybe you don't get as many days of rest as you might need, or you might not get as much as an entitlement to leave as you possibly could if it was, you know, really properly bargained for. Or even something like a conversion right. Like, you know, it's not, employers often don't really want to include conversion rights where a casual employee can convert to a full-time employee or a more permanent position. And it's sort of those things that are in the employee's interest that kind of get left out of these processes.
So, okay, so it sounds like employers are getting away with a lot of dodgy deals that really make it difficult for workers to get good conditions, good pay in the workplace. What are some ways that we can genuinely improve collective bargaining?
Yeah, so it comes down to sort of acknowledging that a real collective agreement is the product of genuine negotiations that is engaged in, you know, as a collective, between the employer and a union representing those employees. And part of facilitating this would be through introducing, stronger good faith bargaining rules that sort of requires the employers to take the process a lot more seriously and to not really sideline the union, to involve them throughout the process and do this before you would put a ballot to the employees, for example. They also must be required to put a offer in bargaining. They can't just sort of consistently stall by refusing to accept something or, counter offer something. Like, there kind of needs to be a bit of a tit for tat in terms of reaching agreement. The Fair Work Act could also provide for arbitration. So if, talks do falter, then, employers should be sort of required to seek arbitration with employees. An agreement that has, little to no union involvement, it kind of needs to have a lot more rigorous approval requirements just to make sure that it is actually in employees' interest. So, strengthening the boot, for example.
So Lily, another problem that we face in Australia is insecure work. This is a problem. How do we fix that?
Yeah, it's a huge problem. So the prevalence of insecure work is something we've seen increase a lot, particularly over COVID. And it's, basically this thread of having workers employed on, casual employment contracts or fixed term contracts with an end date, or as, labour hire employees, or even, through independent contracting in some industries. And basically what this means is it leaves sort of millions of Australian workers stuck in this sort of low wage work that has no job security, like no sort of assurance that you're going to be employed in a few months' time, basically. And this sort of, collectively non-standard employment is now as high as it has ever been in the last 20 years, with, 55.6% of the Australian workforce without any sort of genuine security in their employment. Basically, the solution is we need to, toughen up the Fair Work Act. Like, right now, it's defined, like, definition of casual leaves a lot of room for employers to, say that an employee who is actually a, permanent employee is actually a casual employee. So it lets them redefine their work and reclassify them, and then takes those conditions away. This sort of permits employers to keep these workers in these sort of like irregular and, insecure job patterns for years and years and years. Like, the tertiary sector is a great example of this, where a huge percentage of those employees are stuck on, these casual contracts that have insecure work and sort of end every 3 months and get renewed or might not get renewed. And there's no sort of capacity to plan for the future. And so fixing this would just mean making sure the legislation has, a strong conversion right would be a great starting point. So this is, the right for a worker to apply to their employer to be converted from casual to permanent employment. And right now, that sort of test that lets an employee seek to be converted is quite weak, and it doesn't really acknowledge, just how many workers are casual. And, on top of this as well, like, we really need to take away the incentives for employers to use, labour hire workers. So this would be through something like the same job, same pay principle, where you can't just hire labour hire workers to do the exact same work, but at, lower wages and worse conditions. It sort of forces employers to actually pay them the same, basically.
So Lily, another issue with Australia's labour market at the moment is the growth of the gig economy. This has been a real problem. Is the gig economy a good thing, or can we improve it?
Well, we can absolutely improve it. And that just would be through sort of this acknowledgement that gig economy workers are workers, and that just because they're providing their services through an app doesn't mean that they shouldn't be afforded the same sort of protections that every other worker in Australia gets. So these gig economy platforms, they've basically, unraveled this core assumption that workers are employees. And when you're an employee, you get protection, you get the employment conditions, you get all of the protections of the Fair Work Act. But just because you're using, an app to accept a job doesn't mean that you aren't an employee, basically. And that, this as sort of a sham contracting business model has led to the widespread exploitation of, rideshare drivers, food delivery riders and drivers, and, increasingly care workers. And this has really dire consequences. If you're injured or hurt on the job, like, these companies aren't paying or protecting these workers and their families when they seek, insurance claims, basically.
Right. So we should either make gig work fair by helping workers in the gig economy to have more security, the kinds of rights that typical employees have, or we should shut it down.
Absolutely. There needs to be a sort of intervention.
So I've heard of this idea of free riding. Where workers who aren't in the union still get the benefits of the collective bargaining process that unions negotiate for employees. Why is that a problem? And how would we make more people join the union?
Yeah, I mean, this is basically a problem because it kind of forces unions to, give away their major product or their service for free. And that sort of has this feedback loop where they get smaller and they're unable to sort of sustain the resources that they need to, genuinely bargain with the employer, for example. Like, you kind of need those resources coming in to support itself going forward. And so, in Australia, a non-union employee, they're also covered by and they get the benefits of enterprise agreements that are negotiated by a union, but they don't pay any membership fees or any sort of percentage of fees at all. And going a step further, the Fair Work Act has actually prohibited unions from making any sort of claims or demands for bargaining service fees or having something like that in an enterprise agreement. That sort of assures that maybe some conditions go to union workers.
Right, that is a problem, and I can see how preventing unions from making claims like that creates an unsustainable, and I hate to use the term, but business model for unions. Like, going forward, they have less resources and they are still required to effectively represent all employees, whether or not they're in the union, when it comes to negotiating new enterprise agreements. And that is a problem. I think it's very clear to see. And so what would we need to stop this free rider problem in Australia?
Basically, non-unionists need to sort of make a fair contribution to the work that is undertaken by these unions in winning them better wages and conditions. So there needs to be sort of no legal restrictions in the Fair Work Act on unions offering non-union members a choice. Basically, join the union or contribute to negotiations by paying a fee or a service fee or something like that. And this sort of also helps to build, collectivism in Australian workplaces, because we are the union and you are your union.
So what I'm taking from all of this, Lily, is that, the federal coalition government has neglected to take responsibility for these problems that have been raised, and, the way that the Fair Work Act continues to undermine the work, pay and conditions of workers in Australia. And we really need to reform the Fair Work Act. And these are 6 ways to do it that can improve industrial relations in Australia and create a far more worker-friendly agenda.
Absolutely. I mean, these issues are fixable and we can reform them and we can change them.
Right. And so all it'll take is informing workers that these issues are connected to our labour laws, that these problems we face are actually connected to the laws, the Fair Work Act, that makes this a reality. And we need to fix that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for watching. To download the fact sheet that accompanies this video, go to carmichaelcentre.org.au.